Okay, so the first thing I'll ask you about is the F-35 fighter jet purchase. One of my observations is that Bob Rae sometimes seems to be using much stronger language than what I've seen from Malcolm Allen. These are just on clips on the TV news, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are when you hear that.
Well, our defense critic, Jack Harris, has been quite strong on this since the beginning, as has Matthew Kelway, who's been our procurement expert on these matters. What we're seeing now is that the Conservatives have actually lied to Parliament. They had two sets of books. That's been confirmed for us by Kevin Page, the Parliamentary Budget Officer. So they had one set of books that they were using for public information and one internally new. It was actually $10 billion more. So that's not a rounding error, $10 billion. That has to be done intentionally, and it was done with intent to deceive. So we've been standing up very strongly on this in the House, I believe, every day, and calling the government to account. I'm very happy with the job that we've been doing on this.
And what can you do when a majority government misleads the Canadian public by $10 billion?
What's starting to happen is even people who have been supportive, including some of the Toronto right-wing media, have been very supportive of the Conservatives, are starting to turn on them because they realize that they've reached a breaking point in terms of their disrespect for the very institutions that have given Canada peace, order, and good government for almost 150 years. It sounds trite, but we do tend to take those institutions for granted, as if they were going to continue to be there for us, even if we start to abuse them. The abuse started even before they started imposing closure systematically. Now we're at 18 impositions of closure in the House, unprecedented by any government, and especially in 1 year. But what we've also seen is an abuse of the parliamentary committee process. So we've seen them, for example, using in camera, which means the opposite of what people might think it means. It means behind closed doors. They've been using a rarely used procedure to hold everything behind closed doors. That exists if you have to hear a witness in secret, to protect them, if you have to look at documents that you don't necessarily want to be seen by the public yet. So it's an exceptional circumstance, because the definition of a democracy is that it has to be free, open to the public, open to the press, and that's the normal nature of it. They've been shutting down the committees systematically. We're reaching a breaking point now in terms of the abuse of Parliament and its institutions by the Conservative majority, because it's not because we're a majority government that you can change the very nature of our democracy. That's where we're starting to head, so we're going to have to start hitting back much harder than we've done in the past.
There's a general commentary in the media, and we heard it again this week on CBC News, that you're moving the NDP closer to the centre, and I'm wondering what goes through your mind when you hear that kind of
I'm just going to keep doing the job that I was elected to do, which is to rally all progressives behind the NDP banner. There hasn't been a single policy orientation that's changed on the part of the party since I became leader. We've taken a much stronger attack. I mean, we wanted to be able to take a more systematic attack, build a strong, structured official opposition. That's what we're starting to do. Nathan Cullen's an extraordinary House leader. He's very gifted. As we saw, he's a formidable speaker, but he's also got a very quick mind in terms of parliamentary procedure. He's doing a great job. So that's the type of fight we're bringing to the Conservatives, much more concentrated than in the past. Again, the party itself has to be able to exude one thing: our confidence in our ability to provide the Canadian voting public with competent public administration. Now, that might not be the sexiest slogan you've ever heard in politics, but by definition, since the Conservatives are ruling with 39% of the vote, we know that more than 60% of Canadians want a more progressive view of their country, more progressive policies. And one of the things that sometimes held people back with regard to the NDP, even though we've done a good job in the provinces that we've led, and the one territory that we've been empowering, people sometimes hesitate with regard to whether or not we can actually manage a G7 economy like Canada. So we have to be able to convince them of that, reassure them of that, and that's part of the messaging that we're doing right now.
One of the kind of litmus tests with the left is personal income tax.
Yeah.
And some of the progressives out there, like Robert Reich in the States, or Linda McQuaig and Neil Brooks in Canada, have suggested that for the sake of the economy, high-income earners should be paying significantly more personal income tax. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Well, there's a very different set of circumstances in the States and here. In Nova Scotia, where you pay your 50%, and in Quebec, where it's 48.5%, you're paying that amount. There are very few tax loopholes and tax deductions and ways to hide your money in Canada, unlike the United States. So that's the first thing that has to be taken into account when you make that analysis. The other thing is giving 50 cents on every dollar is already considerable. So long before considering increasing those taxes, I would look at other things like putting our corporate tax rate back to something that resembles the OECD average. We've completely emptied out the cupboard in terms of the fiscal capacity of the government by consenting $50 billion a year in tax reductions for Canada's richest corporations. We can also start going after tax havens, because a lot of work has to be done on that. A lot of companies play a shell game now, even the ones operating in the oil sands. They operate in 100 countries, they have hundreds of subsidiaries and affiliates, they move money around, they don't pay taxes anywhere. Some of these companies...
What is the OECD average for corporate tax?
It's a lot closer to where we were before. We were over 20 before, and we should be back into that range, the OECD range. So we've gone way below that. We're the lowest right now. So that doesn't make any sense, because we've emptied out the ability of the government to provide services. As a result, the Conservatives have now prescribed the remedy for the illness that they've caused and saying, oh, so we'll start cutting services. That's what they started doing in everything from food safety to air traffic safety. They're cutting border security. These are all things that don't make any sense. This is why governments exist, to check the food that we eat and make sure it's safe.
And you think dealing with the corporate tax issue would be sufficient to deal with the service issue?
A financial transaction tax, putting the corporate rates back up to where they should be, making sure we go after money that's being salted off in very many tax havens by a lot of those corporations, making sure that the companies that operate here are paying their taxes for what they earn here. Of course, that'll be more than enough to cover it off. Long before looking at a solution that has to do with individuals. Again, Canadian individuals in many provinces are paying 50% already in taxes, and before being convinced that that has to go up, I'd have to look at the books, and I haven't seen anything to indicate to me that that's the solution.
How much would you raise through this financial transaction tax?
Depends on what it would be set at. The Brits are at 0.05. We were looking at 0.005. We've looked at these with the Tax Justice Network. It can raise billions, but again, it depends where it's set. It has to be enough to generate revenues, but it can't be too much to discourage investment. Right now, we don't have any checks and balances on purely speculative investing, so this might be something that could help act as a brake as money moves so rapidly electronically today.
Another area of concern for some on the left is the North American Free Trade Agreement. And unlike the World Trade Organization, where nations have to come to the table with complaints against nations, under NAFTA, companies can file for arbitration against governments under Chapter 11. And I'm wondering, how supportive are you of the notion that companies can launch trade disputes against governments?
I would have never signed that deal in that state. And it's now a question of enforcement. When I was the Minister of Environment in Quebec, I continued with our ban on 2,4-D. That decision was attacked. 2,4-D is a pesticide manufactured by Dow Chemicals, and it's something that was attacked straight on by the manufacturer of the pesticide. They finally had to back down. We were able to maintain our ban on it, especially with regard to the cosmetic use of that pesticide. So that was an attack taken very much like the Ethyl Corporation attack, which was one of the first ones on an additive for gasoline, where the American company was paid tens of millions of dollars of compensation by the Canadian government, which had tried to ban it on health grounds. One of the things I have seen consistently with regard to the enforcement, the application of the NAFTA, the biggest problem is that the Canadian government consistently rolls over. We don't know how to fight these trade deals. When the Americans came up with their Buy America package of hundreds of billions of dollars to get themselves out of the mess that had been created in 2008, we saw that Canada, again, didn't make any real effort to make sure that the NAFTA was respected. So we're losing both ways.
Do you think the Buy America policy violated NAFTA?
I think it clearly violated NAFTA, and we should have fought it tooth and nail.
And if you had a friendly administration in the United States, would you like to revisit Chapter 11? Is that something that you might propose in a platform?
These deals are always open to renegotiation and discussion. There are always things in there that the other side wants to change. All you have to do is follow American politics to know that it was and will be again. I can guarantee you that the NAFTA will once again be the object of discussion in the forthcoming U.S. presidential election. My answer is going to be, we have a lot of things to discuss as well. Am I going to say that this is a make or break thing? No. because the biggest problem we have, again, is how we fail to enforce our end of the bargain. There are lots of things in the NAFTA that we could be using to our advantage that we're not. And there are also some things in there that are good. Breaking down barriers to interprovincial and international mobility for professions, for example, is something that the European Union got to in the 1950s when British, at the time, an Italian midwife could go to France, for example, or a German doctor could go work in Belgium. Why not? I mean, dentition doesn't change. Yet in North America, you had to rewrite your exams of state to state in the U.S. or province to province very often in Canada. So we've come up with a way of looking at these things with the lens of, is it an artificial trade barrier, or is it transparently necessary for public protection? That's a good thing. When you know that the #1 cause of poverty amongst immigrants to Canada, according to Statistics Canada, is the failure to recognize their credentials and experience and allow them to practice here, breaking down that sort of barrier is actually a good thing.
How do you do it, though, when you've got the provincial jurisdiction and you've got provinces who create, the legislation that confers the authority to license professionals to self-regulating organizations?
The United States adheres even more jealously. Each state has the policing power, a subset of which is licensure, enforcement, and regulation of professions. It's the same thing there. The NAFTA started breaking down the international barriers. Some of the internal barriers started to fall. That's some of the good sides of these agreements. The specific answer to your question is, when you're bringing in people and you want to have them licensed, you've got to get rid of the fake barriers, like very high fees for taking exams. If the last step is to have an internship of some description, you've got to make sure it's actually available, or a residency or something along those lines. You have to have it available for them, and you have to give them a chance to become practitioners in their field. That's something that the federal government can play an active role in, but you're right. Generally speaking, for 6 years I chaired the Quebec Professions Board. It's a subject that I've worked on a great deal over the years. But, again, getting back to the NAFTA, whether, you just announce holus bolus that this thing is bad and it's going to be
Or
gone.
if there's any priorities you would have if you were to renegotiate.
I think that environment has to become a serious priority. It should be borne in mind that the NAFTA was the first international agreement that had a side deal on the environment, so that's something in its favor, but it simply doesn't go far enough. Linda Duncan is one of Canada's best experts on this, but I think it's something that should be brought into these agreements more and more. One of the top priorities for me in terms of international agreements is to make sure we always look at labor standards and environmental standards. Otherwise, we're being dupes. Again, we're going to allow people in other countries with no labor standards, quasi-slaves, and no environmental standards, pure spoliation. If we allow that product to come in and we're told, well, you can't have any barriers, you're dealing evenly. Again, we're not open-eyed about this process. We have to be lucid about the fact that that's not fair trading if they don't have to obey labor standards of any